Morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, and a special welcome to our colleagues in Iceland. I'm Mike Sfrega. I'm the director of the Wilson Center's Polar Institute and our Global Risk and Resilience Program. It really is an honor for us to host the 2020 Stefansson Memorial Lecture entitled Seawomen of Iceland. The centerpiece of today's program is the book entitled Seawomen of Iceland, Survival on the Edge by Dr. Margaret Wilson. And this program is brought to you in a true partnership with the Institute of Arctic Studies at Dartmouth College, the Stevenson Arctic Institute, Arctic Climate Predictions, Pathways to Resilient Sustainable Societies, or ArcPath, which is a Nordic Research Council Arctic Center of Excellence project co-hosted by the Stevenson Institute and the Nansen Center in Bergen. We're also in partnership with the Scandinavian Studies Program at the University of Washington and UArctic. Today's program is a very important part of the Wilson Center's series, a long series of events marking the beginning of the United Nations 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, an annual international campaign focused on the prevention and elimination of violence against women and girls. We hope that you will engage in this discussion as we go forward in the next 90 minutes. It's a pleasure now to begin our program by introducing my friend and my colleague, Dr. Ross Virginia, Myers Family Professor of Environmental Science, and also the Director of the Institute of Arctic Studies at the Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College, and also a Global Fellow of the Polar Institute. And as many of you know, I had the honor and privilege of serving with Ross as the co-lead scholar for the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. Ross, it's an honor to turn over this program to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. It's always a pleasure to be with the Polar Institute, even by Zoom, and thank you for those kind words. I miss spending time with you in person. I should begin by saying I really admire the great work that's being done by you and the Wilson team to keep the Arctic and Antarctic issues in front of the public and policymakers during what are very challenging times for everyone. So could I have the first slide, Michaela? Okay, I believe it's up. First, I want to thank Michaela Stith and Natalie Stevenson for all the work they've done to help pull this together. They've been fantastic, so thank you right off the bat. Worldwide, there are two institutions who are joined by and share a valued relationship with Vilhjálmur Stefansson, famed 20th century Arctic explorer, anthropologist, and public intellectual, and also his partner and Arctic scholar, Evelyn Stefansson Neff, and we'll spend some time learning about her as well. The two institutions are Dartmouth College and its Institute of Arctic Studies, and the Stevenson Arctic Institute in Akureyri, Iceland. Today, Iceland and Dartmouth, we work together to advance a shared research and education agenda to help ensure a more sustainable Arctic future for all. The Stevenson Arctic Institute was established in 1998. It's an independent governmental research institute within the Iceland Ministry for the Environment and Natural Resources. The institute is directed by my friend and colleague, Dr. Niels Einarsson. The institute takes a highly interdisciplinary approach, and it's known for its work on understanding human-environment relations in the circumpolar Arctic. It's also done some very important leading assessments on economic systems and human development, Niels' passion, marine fisheries and governance, and past and present climate change and adaptation and mitigation strategies available to Arctic nations and societies. In a similar vein, the Institute of Arctic Studies at Dartmouth was founded in 1989 to promote interdisciplinary research, provide graduate and undergraduate education on Arctic and polar topics, and to convene public discussion on rapid environmental change and its impacts on Arctic communities and cultures. The Institute is active in international Arctic policy circles, and much of this is in collaboration with Mike and the Wilson Center and the team at the Polar Institute, the University of the Arctic, and as Mike mentioned, the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. The Stefansson Memorial Lecture celebrates the accomplishments of Stefansson and his spouse, Evelyn Stefansson Neff, who together and individually have made seminal contributions to our understanding of the Arctic environment and its peoples. a legacy that holds value for confronting the great issues that confront the rapid changing Arctic of today. Next slide, please. Stevenson, Vilhjálmur Stefansson, was born in 1879 in the Icelandic community of Gimli, Manitoba, Canada. Throughout his life, Stevenson's identity was Icelandic, and it carried through in all of his work, and the reason we're celebrating him today, the two Dartmouth and Icelandic Center in Akureyri. He traveled extensively in the Arctic between 1906 and 1918 before returning to the United States and settling in as an author and a lecturer. He was among the very first anthropologists to adopt Inuit ways for travel and survival, and his writings of the friendly Arctic created a bold new image of these lands and its peoples for the curious, and as Stefansson found, largely uninformed world to the south. So part of Stevenson's mission was to bring reality to the South about the Arctic, but also he foresaw the importance of the Arctic to global affairs and valued the knowledge contributions of Arctic peoples at a time when this was not common. Following his multiple years in the high north of Alaska and Canada, he became a very colorful public intellectual, traveling widely and delivering lectures to packed halls. He was a popular occasional lecturer with the men of Dartmouth in the 1930s and 40s, and in 1951 was appointed as Arctic consultant for the college and moved to Hanover, New Hampshire. In 1952, Dartmouth acquired much of Steph's personal library, including his journals, correspondence, and thousands of books and photographic prints, forming what is now the Stevenson collection on polar exploration. It has grown to become one of the world's premier collections of primary research materials on the Arctic, spanning from the 1600s to 1930. Scholars from all directions come to Dartmouth's Rauner Library to learn from Steph's materials and from Dr. Jay Satterfield, our special collections librarian and a good friend. Next slide, please. Stevenson was a remarkable figure, but certainly did not accomplish all of this on his own. Evelyn Stefansson was hired as a research assistant by Steph, and they were married in 1941. She worked with him as a researcher and librarian and curated their extensive polar collection until Stefansson's death in 1962. Evelyn was an amazing personality and force at Dartmouth College. At the time she was at Dartmouth, it was an all-male institution, and there were no women with faculty status. She quickly stood out as a prominent member of the Dartmouth community and was often the only woman at sort of high-level events at the college. She became very active in what became the Polar Studies program at Dartmouth, and she led its signature Arctic seminar for 2 years during that time. She was also an author and scholar about the Arctic, and she penned a best-selling book, Here is Alaska. Again, penned really in the form of sort of modern science communication. Her books were all highly accessible to young people and the general public. She was a lifelong member of the Society of Women Geographers and was its national president from 1969 to 71. She also wrote an autobiography, and I recommend that you take a look. It's the image at the bottom right here. And the title of this is Finding My Way, the Autobiography of an Optimist. It's really a great read, and it also contains many interesting insights into Stefansson's personality and life. Evelyn passed away in 2009 at the age of 96. And she is buried in Hanover, New Hampshire's Pine Knoll Cemetery next to Stefansson, and just a short walk from their beloved special collections. This is a walk I often take with my students to talk about the Arctic and to talk about the legacy of these two amazing people. Mrs. Neff was awarded the Icelandic Order of the Falcon Medal of Honor. It's a kind of a mouthful, in 2001, and also received an honorary doctorate from Dartmouth in 2002. Evelyn greatly valued the Iceland-Dartmouth connection, as Niels knows well, and she made a very generous gift to join our efforts even more closely and in perpetuity. Evelyn was famous for her parties in Washington, D.C., entertaining the diplomatic and political community in her Georgetown home. More than anything, Evelyn loved to dance and hold conversation about the Arctic. I hope at the time of the 2021 Stevenson Lecture, we can join in person for a celebratory reception inspired by and even provided by Evelyn. So I hope I've piqued your interest to learn a little bit more about Stefansson and Evelyn, two amazing Arctic personalities that have made a lasting contribution to the Arctic that we see today, and their words are still important for thinking about ways to solve future challenges in the Arctic. Next slide, please. The Stevenson Lecture Series began in 1998 and has honored many leading Arctic academics, statesmen, and writers and journalists. I'm gratified and thrilled to see Margaret Wilson's name added to this impressive group. Next slide, please. It only makes sense that an Icelander should introduce a talk on the Seawomen of Iceland. So my colleague, friend, and director of the Stevenson Arctic Institute, Dr. Niels Einarsson, I turn the podium over to you to introduce our speaker, Dr. Margaret Wilson.
Thank you, Ross. I'm speaking here from Akureyri. It's the 1st of December. It's our Independence Day here in Iceland. So we're all in high spirits, of course. I'm not going to read Margaret's bibliography. You have that on the website, but I just want to say a few words in terms of introduction. And it really gives me great pleasure to introduce Margaret as this year's Stefansson Memorial Lecture. And the first thing I want to say about Margaret, because I've had the pleasure of knowing her for a few years, is that she's an extremely humble person. And it's such a delight to work with Margaret. And she's not good at self-promotion. So I'm going to say a few nice words about Margaret. She grew up in a small coastal community on the Oregon coast, a community which was struggling with poverty and problems. I think that has given her a special perspective, along with her actually having served or worked as a deckhand on fishing boats for several years, which is a very unique experience for a scholar. So she basically knows what she's talking about. And I think this has given her a much deeper and more profound understanding and appreciation of the subject, especially this subject of the Seawomen of Iceland and indeed Seawomen of the world. And what I find particularly impressive with Margaret is how she does research with people rather than on people. It's a research philosophy which is nowadays sometimes called co-production of knowledge, which is a popular term. But I find that she does that in every way through her practice. So Margaret works is timely and urgent. And like all good research, it raises many more topics for future exploration. And if you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, gender equality and decent work and economic growth, they combined have very strong implications for Icelandic fisheries. And Margaret has shown the historic importance of women in fisheries, an aspect that is no less relevant today. And in a post-COVID economic recovery atmosphere, with the larger issues of climate change adaptation looming, we can see in Margaret's research how women's work in fisheries is not an artifact of the past, but in fact, a key to a sustainable future. Gender equity in fisheries and opportunities for the next generation of women fishers will certainly be a key to sustainability in coastal communities in Iceland, and we have Margaret to thank for laying the important groundwork in understanding the complex aspects of Icelandic sea women. Margaret, the Zoom is yours. Thank you.
Niels, that was so, that was a bit overwhelming. It was a very lovely introduction, I have to say. Thank you. I'd like to first thank the Stefansson Arctic Institute in Akureyri and also the Institute of Arctic Studies in Dartmouth for inviting me to give this lecture, to join this group of incredibly prestigious people who have given it before. I am indeed humbled by being asked. And also to thank the Polar Institute Wilson Center for hosting it. And also to acknowledge ArcPath, for which it's been wonderful. I've been in an international collaborative group of which I've been a part for a few years now. It's very lovely. So just saying thanks for everybody. So Iceland has had a relationship with fishing that goes back over 1,000 years. Now, when the country became inhabited, it was first settled by the Icelanders, the Norse, in the mid-800s. They then formed for the first modern democracy of Europe. And that lasted for 400 years. And then, due to infighting, a lesson we can probably all listen to now, they then became ruled by Denmark for 600 more years. The Danish took their rule very seriously, and it was quite oppressive. Icelanders for that period most Icelanders lived in abject poverty. They lived on marginal farms usually. In every spring, it was a hungry spring. Starvation was always a threat, and all too often a reality after a long winter. But what helped Icelanders survive during these centuries of hardship was fish. So if I can have my first slide. They went out in, has the slide come up? To the next slide, if I could. Yeah, that's great, thank you. They went out in simple rowboats. They didn't have sails until the later part of the 1800s. They had about 4 to 12 rowers per boat, and they dragged the boats up. They had to be able to be dragged up on rocky lava shores. Next slide. Because they fished, the winter was the best time, the most lucrative time to fish. And because they were in scattered farms and around the country, they would come together to fish and live in, this is a reconstruction of one of their fishing huts that people lived in. They didn't have any heat, but accounts say that it was warm enough because they packed so many people in them. They also say, one person said, the sawed roofs leaked if there was even a thought of rain around. There are many accounts of the Arctic seas were the weather could change very quickly and breakers could rise. If I can, next slide. And there's a lot of reports of people and the skills of people managing to come in through huge surf. Next slide. There's also far too many reports of this, that boats capsized and flipped. Thousands died. I said every kinsperson or every person had a kin or somebody they knew who had drowned. So the ocean gave a great bounty, but also at a very heavy price. One thing that's consistent in the representation of this history is that it's all male. When I first went to Iceland, quite a couple decades ago now, A friend of mine showed me that reconstructed fishing hut I just showed you, and it was in commemoration of one of Iceland's greatest fishing captains in historic times in the 19th century. And that captain was a woman. At the time, I was surprised and intrigued, especially given my background. And I asked, well, are there other women in the history who are fishing, or are there women now who are fishing? And people mostly said no. They said in the history there weren't really any, and there are very few today. Being as where I grew up, I mean, I could fish. I could work at fishing. Yes, you're usually alone, but I could work at fishing. I worked in other countries fishing. There were families as I was growing up that went to Alaska, women fish. So I thought, here's Iceland has reputedly the greatest gender equality in the world. I just thought, really? Really? So I decided to investigate with my wonderful research assistants, by the way. And the research I did in two arms. One was a historical part, which was up through the early 1900s, and then a more current part. For the historical part, I need to say something quickly about Iceland's literary history, or the relationship with it. Iceland had basically 100% literacy for centuries, at least well enough to be able to read religious texts and this sort of thing. Women were not really taught to read much. I mean, why do we need to teach women? It's a waste of time. But men were. And they were obsessive about it. The poetry was highly elevated, still is. And men, these were just common farmers living in their hovelled houses with barely enough food to eat. They wrote autobiographies. They wrote about their neighbors. They wrote about events. They wrote about everything, how many boats there were. And officials also wrote copious amounts. But when these men felt that women were worth writing about, they did. And luckily, quite a few did. The result of this is a written history, a written record, I'd say, of the Iceland common people that now, to my knowledge, is unique. It's amazing. It's a phenomenal record. What we found upon going through those records was astonishing to me and to other people since, actually. We found not just a few records of women working at sea in the historic times. We found not just dozens and dozens. We found hundreds. It was amazing how many. And we found women, they were applauded, roundly applauded for their incredible contributions. They were incredibly strong rowers, very vital. They were very good at bringing in seals. They were very good at weather reading. They were very good helmsmen, and they were very good captains. Next slide. This picture, which is a lovely picture, but it's actually rather inaccurate. It's supposed to be of the captain Haldora, who was in the mid-1700s. They didn't have sails until the latter part of the 1800s, so it wouldn't have been a sail. But the big difference is Haldora only took female crew. So it should all be women in that boat. She constantly had competitions with her two brothers, who had two other boats where they had male crew. And guess who won? The women consistently were reported as bringing in the most fish. So next slide. This is Þuríður Einarsdóttir, who is the person to whom that fishing hut is commemorating. She was one of the most renowned fishing captains of her time in Iceland's 19th century, first part of the 19th century. She wore trousers. Many women wore trousers at sea because the wool skirts were terrible. But Þuríður also wore them on land, not to disguise herself as a man, but because she said it was more practical. She was also, I'm writing a book on her, by the way. I could do the whole talk on her. She's amazing. But she was also known as being incredibly observant. And the reason there was so much written about her was not because she was a fantastic sea captain. Women, they had to do something else exceptional because there were so many of them. And she almost single-handedly solved one of Iceland's most notorious crimes of its 19th century through her incredible deductive skills. So thinking about this, all these women, which there's tons of accounts, then how come we don't know about them? How come they disappeared? How come they're not more apparent in today's sense of what is reality? Luckily, Iceland has such a fantastic record, written record, that we can find that out. And so toward the latter part of the 1800s, as we were reading these accounts, they begin to change. Now, this is when Iceland is going through a lot of changes. They're working toward their independence, happy Independence Day today, which they didn't get until 1944, but they're working toward it at this point. They also, there's another shift growing on. There's the gender divisions, there's a lot of more influence from Europe. And the gender divisions are becoming much more concretized. And there's this growing idea of the woman should be a housewife. This was becoming elevated, that was her role. And so you see the accounts begin to change. She was fantastic at sea. She was as good at sea as she was at knitting. Or it was said she liked to be at sea as much as working in the kitchen. So she's still being applauded for her work at sea, but she's firmly being placed within the house. And her sea work is now adjunct. It's outside of her primary role. In the early 1900s, you see this shift again. Then you begin to get derogatory comments about women at sea, but you also get, if people want to defend them, they write, oh, you might think she was a troll because she went to sea, but she looked as good in silk dresses, appropriate, as sea clothes. So it's now unwomanly for women to go to sea. Another major thing that happened in Iceland at this time, it's called Iceland's Industrial Revolution, is when they got motorized boats, bigger boats, kind of trawler type boats that would go out for much longer and come back. They caught much more fish. And whereas the other boats, they would pull them up on shore, these boats, new boats, needed harbors. Also before, the people who fished processed their own fish. But now that was no longer possible. You had a huge migration of Icelanders to these fishing communities, and you had a beginning of a wage labor and a division of labor. You had people on shore who were processing fish, and the people on the boats who were actually doing the fishing. And guess what? In this division, the people on shore earned very low wages were women, and the people on the boats were men. And this is when the sea becomes masculinized. When you first start hearing reports of women are not lucky on boats and things like that, they have a superstition. Next slide. Women did still continue on the more subsistence, smaller fisheries. There aren't very many pictures, but here's just a few. This is a woman just going out in the south of Iceland in the probably late 1800s, early 1900s. Next slide. Yeah, and here's one from 1900. These people are all in their Sunday best, but this boat was apparently half women and half men crew on it. Next slide. This next slide is from 1920. It only says that she is a fisherwoman. I don't know anything about her, but I love the slide, so you're getting it anyway. Next slide. This is from the 1940s, and you see it's a very traditional kind of boat. They probably have a motor on it, but it's a whole family fishing with the woman and the kid. Note the kid. People went to sea very, very early. The woman I'm writing about, 30, she went out at 11, but that was very, very common. You didn't have any women on the larger vessels until the 1940s. Then you see some reports. And they mostly come on as cooks, some deckhands, later as radio operators. One can speculate that maybe they got on because many Icelandic men at great risk were then transporting fish to Britain to feed them during the war. But you start getting these reports. And then next slide. And then you get more women coming on in the 1950s. Now, this is the second part of the research, which was with women who are alive. And they were interviews talking with people. For that, with my wonderful research assistant, who also worked at sea herself, we drove all around Iceland and went to practically every small community in the country. Iceland's of a size you can do this. We had many adventures doing this too. And we basically go in and talk to people and say, oh, are there any women fishing here? And almost always you get people first saying, no, 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 there aren't any. And after you have a couple cups of coffee and talk to people, they would say, well, actually, Maria's fishing. She's been doing it for 30 years, actually. Oh, my mother fishes, to tell you the truth. Oh, Aileen also. So all these women would come out of the woodwork. And so we started interviewing them all between the 1950s and to the 2000s. We interviewed about 200 women, names of many more. We also interviewed men who went with women, and we interviewed male skippers. All the skippers of the larger boats were men. Because of that, we were able to look at trends or most information you get on women, it's like one story, which is great, or just a couple women, you know, it's exceptionalized. But this was so many women that we could see just what happened in a larger sense. So looking at that, what did we find? Why did women go to sea? Iceland at this time, there wasn't much mobility. The roads were terrible. And people living in these small coastal communities, pretty sparsely populated, during the winter, they couldn't leave at all for various periods because of the weather. And that was their life, was basically in that community. And there were two types of jobs. You could work in the fish factory or you could go to sea. And we're going to sea made a ton more money than working in the fish factory. And it was still totally gender divided. Women into the 1990s in Iceland in rural communities made 55% of what men made. And that is mostly because of this gender division. So was money. If women worked at sea, they got the same share as a man. That's very important. And that's what women said. They said, I wanted to go to sea because all the guys were making all this money. Why wouldn't I make money too? Also, they grew up with fishing. They were from fishing families and they talked about it. They wanted to go to sea. It was the job to have and they all loved it. One woman talks about how she messed around on her grandfather's boat by the time she was 2. Often women talked about it was something in their blood. They felt it was a knowledge that they shared that had been passed through generations, for centuries. They wanted to join that thread. And they talked about their love of the sea. And after they were fishing, they still talked about it. That was a really important aspect. So how were they received when they went on the boats? That's another question. They talked about what it was like to get on. Now, as one woman said, they knew they were swimming against the current. They were often the only woman on the boat. So most of them said that if it was guys from their own communities, often this is how they got the job. They were related to or knew the skipper. And so that wasn't a problem. It was guys they knew from growing up. It was usually the people from outside who were on it. The more there were, the more problematic it was. And they had to prove themselves. Most greenhorns on boats do, but with women it had a specific sort of sexualized edge. And they talked about that. And they said, well, in order to be successful at sea as a woman, you had to be strong and agile and quick, the things that everybody at sea needs. But in addition, you need to have incredible social skills. You had a very good sense of humor. You had to actually like ribald humor. You had to not take yourself that seriously. And you need to be able to be very clear on your boundaries. They talked about, they usually called it teasing, not hazing, but they said you could never get angry because it was clearly a play for dominance. And if you got angry, you were allowing them to dominate you. And it was very important that you just set your equality. The successful women, which was the vast majority, most people talk to, did that. And at that point, from that point on, they were part of the team. And the men that worked with them became some of their greatest friends for life. And I saw this at parties. I saw it again and again. But there was discrimination that did continue. And that was not on the boats, but on shore. And it was between both men and women. And women said, the women at sea said it never stopped no matter how long. You know, they've been fishing for 20 years. They were often accused of being lesbians. That was meant as an insult. The lesbians somehow having a corner on fishing. Or they were whores. That was the other, sometimes both, they said, contradictory. And they were sleeping with all the men. That's something that they said never went away. Now, what did the skippers think? The male skippers, some of them said it actually they didn't feel it really made any difference having a woman on board, but a lot said it did. It was so there were several skippers who thought it was made such a difference that they consistently hired from 2 to 4 women always on their boats, looking over a 20-year period. They said one woman didn't really make a difference. You had to have 2. And so they really liked to have also a way to do shifts in a cabin, but they liked to have 2 to 4 women on their boats. They said that the effect was the men worked harder, they were more efficient, the morale on the boat was much, much better. They had fewer fights or arguments, and that the atmosphere was so much better that it improved the whole teamwork on the boat. There was one skipper that felt this way so strongly that over a long period, he hired half and half on his crew. It's about a 14-person crew, and he always had half women and half men. I was able to not only talk with him, but a whole bunch of his crew members. And they remembered it as a nostalgic time. They loved it. A couple marriages came from that period. They said it was like a family. And this is something I consistently heard, is that the women, in a sense, they diffused that shore-sea divide, that they brought onto the boat a more integrated community that they felt was not so far from shore, that people felt more connected. And this family atmosphere, if you had more boat, was quite strong. So next slide, please. You saw, this is from this Unur is from the 1960s. She later, sorry, there's a plane going overhead. I hope this doesn't disturb. I can't control that. So this is Unur. She's from the 1960s. She later became a well-known marine biologist, did some great discoveries. Next slide. In the 1970s, you see a surge of women going to sea. It goes up to about 13% of the large vessels. We can't tell on the smaller vessels, they're not registered, but the larger vessels, it's about 13%. And you saw for the first time, and women said the women's movement inspired them. They felt empowered by it. That was when they said, if guys can do it, we can do it. This is Sigurðin. You saw women starting to go to the Navigational Academy to become skippers on unlimited tonnage skippers. She was the first woman who did it in the late 1970s, excuse me. And next slide. The next slide is Inga Fanny. Next slide, yes. Oh no, what happened to the next slide? It's gone. Oh. Well, the next slide was going to be, oh, there we go, that's it. This is Inga Fanny. She was one of the very first large vessel unlimited tonnage skippers qualified as well. She's on a fishing boat there in her younger years. She's still at sea working. In fact, I think she's at sea right now as we speak. She's now a first officer on a large, one of those big, cargo boats, international cargo boats. Then the number of women goes down to about 10% or something through the 80s. It's all economy and all sort of things. And then it goes up again in the 1990s. Next slide. When we saw, yeah, this is Vigdis and Vilhjálmur. They're cousins. They worked together at sea many, many years. Through the 90s, this is just showing the kind of fishing in the 90s. Next slide. And of course, this is in the far north. So as with anybody who's working at sea and through the winters in the far north, it's freezing cold and it's dark a lot. So then what happened in the 2000s this is very interesting to see what happened, is that you began to see the percentages of women go down. They went down to 10%, 8%. Before, in the boom years before Iceland's 2008 collapse, it went down to 6%. After the collapse, it went to 4%. And now it's almost none. There are very few women working in fishing at all in Iceland. And in the smaller fisheries, you still see women, such as the one in the beginning slide who's doing for lumpfish. But in the commercial fisheries, very, very little, almost none. Why? Just a few reasons that have contributed to this. One is Iceland's fisheries policies, fishing rights policies that have shifted the fishing rights from being licensed and owned by various skippers and communities to essentially a privately owned commodity futures market where you have the right for the projected yields for in perpetuity, incredibly valuable thing to own that most people couldn't afford actually to buy. So what's happened over the decades that that's been in place is that the fishing rights in Iceland have now more largely been consolidated to 4 or 5 corporations. So that means that these little communities where everybody was fishing before, they no longer, many of them are no longer able to fish the fish in front of them. They're no longer connected to fishing. So the one thing is that the women, in order to fish now, have to go someplace else. It's hard enough anyway. They have to fish with people they don't know. They don't want to do that, honestly. The other thing is that people in these communities are getting less and less connected to fishing. When I talk to women in these communities now, they don't mess around on their grandfather's boat anymore. They don't do much on the sea. They don't get into the wharf. They don't do anything with fishing. They do other things. So you're getting a society where they're getting much less connected to the fishing. Only something like 3%, Niels can give us the exact, I'm sure, of people in Iceland altogether fish. So you see this huge change there. Also, the mobility in Iceland has improved massively. The roads are much better than they used to be. And people with cars, they can go to Reykjavik. There was some sliding away from these communities, although I'm glad to say some people are going back now. You have real big economic changes. Now, tourism, not this year, but usually tourism and now aluminum smelting are big economic boosts. So fishing is no longer seen as the job to have. When people are looking at the job, they're looking at better education. Women have much better access to education. Their income equality is much higher. So it's really changed. And so women aren't going into it. So your gender in the maritime is very low in Iceland right now. But I don't want to leave us with that. Some positive things are happening though, and it's quite, yeah, it's exciting to see. Some things are the actual result of this research. I feel so honored. This is so, to have this happen of one's research is so exciting. In a part of West Iceland where I've spent quite a bit of time, and have several of these little fishing communities, I gave a series of talks a while ago, a couple of years ago, and the women there who were listening to the talks got really mad that their own history of women fishing in their communities had been basically erased, but not erased because of the records, that's good. And they had the names of about 4 women, or knowledge of about 4 women, and they hadn't done the historical research like I had though, but I had about 80 for that same area. So they applied for a grant, they got it, and now they're putting together this permanent exhibit, which will be in various parts of that whole area about all these women. I gave them all my research on that, so they now have it. And of course, it's their ancestors. So I can look at the tip of the iceberg. They can find so much more. They've made it all come alive. It's really exciting to see it growing now. So that's really exciting. Also, I'm very excited to be a part of a collaborative exhibit, stalled a bit now with the pandemic, but between the Akureyri with the Stevenson Institute there and with Dartmouth on a gender in fisheries, an international look at it, and an exhibit, which will be interactive, will be very exciting, this planned. Also, you have right now in policy in Iceland, not in fisheries rights, but in other areas, people are encouraging much more gender equality. You're seeing lots more women go into the search and rescue maritime area. Also, interestingly enough, in the Navigational Academy, there are lots of women going through right now, and also going into marine engineering. So we don't know what's going to happen with that. It's very interesting to see. We'll just have to see. And other people are such as Lauren, who is, she's a qualified large vessel skipper, and she grew up in a fishing family, and she worked in fishing a long time. But she's now actually living in Seattle, and she is spearheading here a thing called, it's from Iceland, called 100% Fish, where it's sort of, we look at climate change, the changing in the fisheries, and it's utilizing the whole fish. So you're getting less fish now, but you're making use of our resources in a much better way. She's sort of teaching it to people here, actually, expanding that whole. So it's, I think, you know, we're in change, but I think if we're aware of it, we keep working at it, we keep thinking about it, keeping on the forefront and balance with change. I think, you know, women, gender equality in the maritime is something we can work for. I think it's exciting. I think we can find that. I think I'll leave us with Inga Fanny, the one who's at sea right now. One time we were talking, and I was talking to her about all this, and she said, Margaret, she goes, Margaret, we will survive. She gave me a look with her steely gray blue eyes. She says, that's what we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Margaret. That was interesting and exciting and important. And I think in particular, Stefansson would have enjoyed the use of ethnography and appreciation for history in informing us about the Arctic of today, but also what the Arctic might become. So wonderful talk. I want to let the audience know that we'll be taking a couple of questions for Margaret, and then we'll have two presentations, one by Embla and one by Linda. And then Margaret will join them for a panel discussion. So please start sending in questions that you might have for any of them or all of them as a group. And the way you do that is send them to polar@wilsoncenter, one word, .org. polar@wilsoncenter.org, and we'll do our best to get to your question. Okay, so I'm scanning here to see what we have. Well, kind of an interesting question here, going into the history here, Margaret. You know, given the time periods that you were talking about, the role of women in moving around the marine environments of Iceland, do you think, the question is about the settlement at Landsea de Meadows in Canada, where do you think the real Vinland was? And are there any information about women and perhaps their role or their travels, being among the very first across the waters into North America? Did you find any interesting hints of this in your work?
I am not, officially, I'm not a saga scholar. There of course are. I have, you know, this person who's writing it probably has as much idea about where Vinland was. There's so much speculation, you know, in parts of Canada, what it was. The sagas have quite a few women in them, which is very exciting. There were women one woman who was known to bring the fish into the fjord. She was known for that. There was one woman who she was definitely ahead of her boat. There's several who were ahead of their boats when they came over, their long ships escaping Norway, just as the men did in setting up settlements in Iceland. Whether, I mean, there definitely, this Guðrúður, there are certain women who definitely went to the New World, and Guðrúður, but the reports that I was able to get, I mean, in the saga, sorry about that. There's one in Gisli's saga of a woman who is rowing madly, and she basically saves Gisli and he gives her, she's a slave, and he gives her freedom because of that. So there's some reports of that kind. The ones that I've looked at, mostly the reports that I've found come from sort of there's some in the 1600s. You don't get a lot before that. So it's mainly from the 1600s through into the 1900s. But that is a fascinating question.
Yeah, it's a good one. Thank you, Margaret. I noticed that someone named Niels Einarsson has their hand up essentially to ask a question. So Niels, I turn it to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Margaret, for a fantastic talk. You mentioned the sort of disappearing or dwindling connection between people, even in the coastal communities, with the sea, with the fisheries, with the resources, basically, that we're lucky here in Iceland that we have fairly bountiful still marine resources, fish stocks to harvest. But of course, this is not just a problem for women, it's a problem for everyone in a system which has been fairly closed in terms of privatization and the with private property rights and catch rights, which need to be bought for people in terms of people need to buy if they want to enter fishing. But there is this small scale fishing in the summer, which is like an open access, and so there's an opportunity there for almost anyone, except you basically need access to quite a lot of capital, a boat, and you need to have a skipper's ticket, small scale skipper's ticket. And these are obstacles as well, but these are also obstacles to everyone. But it seems that this is not making it any easier for women to enter fishing, because a lot of people enter fishing in small scale fishing and then go on over to maybe the more capital intensive, larger scale. Can you unmute yourself, Margaret?
So, yeah, so are you asking, Niels, if they are going from that small scale fisheries to why not?
Yeah. Well, can you give us some solid policy advice here? How can we fix this?
I wish. I think certainly there are lots more women. I mean, 30 minutes, I couldn't talk about, but in the smaller scale fisheries, you do still see women, and that's really lovely. And some of them are running their own boats. Quite a few of them, they're doing it with families for the line and jig for the summer fishing. And also, for instance, the woman, for example, there on the first slide, the introductory slide, Valle, who grew up fishing, but she's fishing with her husband and her daughter and her son and her son's girlfriend. So they're running 2 boats now in the summer doing lumpfish row. So there is some, but what I do find is this obstacle that other people have as well. This is not gender specific, although sometimes women have harder times getting funding, but the boats are expensive and getting the fishing rights is very expensive. So, I mean, in fact, I think it was when I gave a talk in Akureyri once, that when I said, well, the people are invisible, or the people are, and a woman stood up in the audience who said, well, I work at sea, I've been fishing in my life, and she's right, women are invisible. And then she said, but really, we're all invisible, all of us fishermen. men or women. And she was saying in a larger sense that in a sense we're being not allowed to, it's so hard to enter it now, just for your common person. So it's much less accessible now. That's what I remember her saying. I mean, Niels, you know this very well. You know this better than me.
Well, thank you, Margaret. I think what we can do now is turn to the panel, which will add a range of new material and new ideas that we can then bundle together with your talk and have a discussion around communities, fisheries, gender, and the health of the ocean. I think that's a big part of the future of women in fishing is we need healthy oceans. And one of our speakers is very, very engaged in that. So remember to keep sending your questions in, and we'll keep accumulating these and bring them out at the end of the panel. So our first speaker is from Alaska. So we're going to get an Alaska perspective on small scale fisheries and gender and other issues around the sustainability of fishing. And this is Linda Benken. She's the executive director of the Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association. I'm proud to say that Linda is a graduate of Dartmouth College, and following her undergraduate work and some graduate work, she moved north to Alaska, and she's been a commercial fisherman there since 1982. But her work goes well beyond just what happens on a boat. She's been very engaged in the organization of peoples around sustainable fisheries, around community health, and sustaining the health of the ocean, which she very much loves. She is the holder of the 2020 Heinz Prize for the Environment for her internationally recognized work on behalf of the oceans. This is an exceptional honor, and Linda, it's wonderful to have you here to learn about your work and maybe a little bit about the situation in Alaska. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Ross, for that introduction, and Margaret for that wonderful presentation. That was really fascinating to listen to and really made me want to jump right in and talk about what's going on with consolidation in Alaska. I am going to try and share my screen so I can show you some pictures of Alaska. See if we can make this work. Great. I thought I think I can pick up on a lot of the themes that Margaret talked about, but that I would try and give you a little background of my history getting into fishing, and then the work of our organization to promote small scale fisheries and to maintain space in the fisheries. Well, first keep the resource healthy, but also for fishing families, because that's what drives our communities here, and also really what I'm so passionate about, involving fishermen and taking care of the ocean. So I actually grew up in Connecticut and did go to Dartmouth, and I'd grown up fishing, not fishing, grew up on the ocean doing a lot of sailing, but not fishing. I loved wild places, and that of course brought me to Alaska. And I took a ferry up to Alaska the first time out of Seattle. It's a 3-day trip to get to Sitka, which is where I live. And I had pretty much decided by the time I got off the ferry that this is where I wanted to live. And it did take me quite a while that first summer. Well, it was March, so spring, to get a job in a boat. And every time I would see someone haul out a boat, I would go offer to help paint or scrape or just find some way that I could work and help out. And eventually, when a deckhand didn't show up or showed up drunk, I got my first chance to go fishing and filled in for just a day or two. But that was enough. Word travels fast, and skippers talk to skippers, and finally a family hired me to work with them for the summer. And fishing out of Sitka, we were, it was a husband and wife team. They had their 2-year-old on board. We would do week-long trips, and with very little time off in between. But I loved it. I loved the hard work. I loved the sense of camaraderie that would build on the boat when we were all working really hard together. And I really loved what the sort of family atmosphere when you were in town. There were families working on boats. There's a lot of kids running around on the docks. There were always cookouts happening and people showing up to share music or share fish. There weren't that many women working on boats, but the women who were either running their own boats or working on boats were well respected. And there were certainly people I looked up to. And I ran into all kinds. There were skippers who preferred to hire women, especially on the trawlers, because they knew women, or they thought women would take really good care of the fish and were more adept at managing the gear. And then there were skippers who didn't think women were strong enough. And there were also skippers who had wives who wouldn't let them hire women if there was just going to be the two of them on the boat. So really there was that full spectrum. But I worked on quite a few boats. These days were the derby days up in Alaska for longline fishing, was really what I preferred. So a lot of our openings were these short, sometimes 3 days where you worked around the clock, sometimes 5, sometimes 24 hours. And you fished in whatever weather there was, because that was your couple chances out of the year to go make your living. And I was going back and forth, going to college and using the money I made from fishing to put myself through college and then through graduate school. And after graduate school, I bought my first boat, which incidentally was called Fantasia when I bought it. And I changed the name, partially thumbing my nose at those, the superstitions that not only is it bad to change the name of your boat luck-wise, but it's bad to have a woman on the boat. So I thought I'd just do both. Take it all on. So I would fish my boat during the summer months and in between also crewing on a little bit larger boat. We had a 5-person crew on this boat, and we'd start off in Southeast Alaska in the early spring and work our way up to the Bering Sea Aleutian Islands, longlining for halibut and sablefish, and then take a break in the summer and I'd fish my boat and then pick up fishing on this boat again during the late fall. And I would say that during this time, I did start to see some increase in women on boats. But yeah, still pretty much a male dominated world. So let's see my own history. I then around this time got married and we had a couple kids, and our boat got kind of small my boat got kind of small with the kids on board. We started taking both of them in about 5 months. So my spouse and I purchased this boat, which is the boat we currently have. It's just under 40 feet. So in our world, big. We longline for halibut and sablefish and also troll for salmon in the summertime. And I've seen recent numbers that show that about 12% of the workforce, the harvesting workforce now in Alaska is women, and 33% of the processing workforce in Alaska is women. So I think that's probably an increase from where it was when I started, but you do see women running boats, working on boats, families working on boats. We do have the full range up here, and I really celebrate that. Let's see, I am still fishing with my kids on the boat. They're a little bit older than this now, but they're really involved. And I see most of the people who are able to get started, the young people getting started in the fisheries in Alaska right now, do grow up on boats, and they have that as an entry level. But it's an increasing challenge, and something when we also switched after Iceland, but also switched to an individual fishing quota system, where people who had a history were issued quota, but if you weren't issued quota, you have to purchase that quota. And we've seen all the same consolidation of those access rates, a real reduction in the number of boats involved in the fisheries, and a real effort to try and keep families and small scale boats, small scale operations that are so important to our coastal communities and our connection to the sea, just keeping space in these fisheries and able to be viable and successful which has really been the focus of my work. And so maybe now is where I'll switch to talking a little bit about, I know it's called the Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association, but I like to say that it's an inside joke that actually stands for the Alaska Little Fisherwomen's Association, because we do all we can to involve women in the fisheries as well. This was my all-women crew one summer. So the group I run is really focused on helping maintain a healthy ocean and a place for family fisheries. We did work through the development of the quota share system to try and limit the amount of consolidation so that we would save space for these small scale fisheries, and happy to share the measures we were able to include in our program they've certainly been important. I'm not sure they've done enough, but we've done, I think, a better job than anywhere else of keeping independent small scale fishermen in the fisheries and despite having a quota share system in place. So our organization was started well before my time, really in response to what foreign fishing was doing to the fisheries off Alaska, and trying to promote not only local fisheries, but also taking care of the fish here and rebuilding the stocks that really had been wiped out mostly by foreign trawlers operating off our coast. We address the challenges to the resource and to our communities through engagement in policy and getting fishermen involved in research and advocating for good stewardship, both in their own work and then by others who share the ocean with them. And then we do a lot to try and teach people about the work of our fishermen, and also teach fishermen about how important it is to be involved in taking care of the resource, with a lot of focus right now on helping the next generation of fishermen. So I won't spend much time on these, but we are involved at the national level in pursuing these issues, same issues of promoting opportunities for small scale fisheries. We work with fishermen similar fishermen from all around the country who face similar challenges, and work on national legislation that's really important to our fishing communities as well as theirs in all different parts of the coast of America. And then in Alaska, we're very focused on helping keep the habitat healthy, promoting science-based fisheries management. There's a lot of politics and big money in fisheries in Alaska, so trying to keep the focus really on taking care of the fish and taking care of our fishing communities. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about this network. So in the early 80s, these foreign fleets, the foreign trawl fleets, did really wipe out the fish off of Southeast Alaska. And in the 90s, when I first took over running the Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association, I led a campaign to close this area to trawling, and we were successful in that in 1998. So at the time, it was the biggest trawl closure anywhere in the world. And once we had accomplished that, we really turned our focus to, okay, as the stewards of this resource here in Southeast Alaska, what can we do to improve our stewardship of this ocean and at the same time improve the success of our fishermen? Because to me, those two have to be tied together for solutions to be durable. So one of the first issues we tackled was bycatch issues of how do we help fishermen who know what habitat fish associate with have a really good image in their mind of what the bottom of the ocean looks like. This is a typical chart with soundings that are pretty far apart. There's a whole lot of variation in the bottom of the ocean. Here it's as complex as I'm sure it is off of Iceland as it is on land with the equivalent of mountains, pinnacles. But it's really difficult in fishing around this kind of rough habitat to have a sense of what the bottom of the ocean looks like. So what we first did was find maps of areas that had been mapped with side scan sonar by scientists, and transform that information into a system that could be used on our boats. So make that data available to our fishermen. So that's the same area. Hopefully you can see that the image on the right just shows the topography of the bottom of the ocean. So a fisherman can fish around that area, stay out of that really rough bottom where there's pinnacles that host sponges and corals and all kinds of sensitive habitat. Also that's rockfish associate with, and be able to fish near it, which is really productive for halibut or king salmon, but not run into the sensitive habitat and not catch too many of the rockfish that are very easily overfished. But there was only very limited areas that were mapped this way with this kind of technology, and this kind of technology is way more expensive than our boats could afford. So we next worked on setting up our fleet to be able to collect seafloor bathymetry data when they were out fishing, because they spend so much time out there fishing. And we thought if we can get our fleet working together to gather this data, to provide the data back to us, then we can provide them some incredible data that they can all share and have this really good image of the seafloor. So we started that effort. It's now been about 6 years. At first, the program we're using, which is a Nobletech Time Zero program, crashed after we combined about 3 fishermen's worth of data. But over time, we've worked with the software makers to improve the system so that now we've been able to incorporate all the areas that were mapped by with this side scan sonar, but also all the data, 240 million data points at this point from our fleet. So all that red is lines or dots that all run together, that where fishermen's onboard system have been picking up that seafloor bathymetry data. And that's, let's see if I can get this to work. Oh, I guess not. So this is the kind of map we've been able to create for our fishermen with the data they've provided us. So we have that level of detail now from the work that our fishermen have done in collecting data. They now have the best maps of this area, seafloor maps, that anybody has, despite the fact that none of them could have afforded the kind of equipment to purchase these maps. And we now provide this information back to these maps to the stock assessment scientists to inform the scientific process, because the maps we have are better than the maps that they have. Some of the other collaborative projects we've involved our fishermen in has been working with each other, but also working with scientists, bringing sort of that a unique perspective. Fishermen are so good at problem solving. Scientists are really good at being sort of regimented in their careful approach to documenting success and change. And so when you get them together, at first they're a little suspicious, but boy, very quickly the conversations get rich. And we had a growing issue, still do, with sperm whales taking black cod off our long lines when we're fishing. And we knew that was bad for the fishermen, because they can pretty well clean you out. Also can present a threat for the whales being around hooks and lines. And so we worked with a host of partners to try and understand what was drawing the whales to our boats. We tested different deterrents. We figured out how they knew to find us when we're hauling gear. They hear us shifting in and out of gear, that's the dinner bell. And so we've tested a decoy buoy that mimics the sound of our boats hauling gear, and we've been able to draw them away from active sets at times. We've tried other deterrents. They're pretty smart critters. So at this point, we've realized that probably our most effective strategy is to help fishermen know where the whales are through a towed array device that pinpoints where they are and shares that information with the fleet. We satellite tagged our serial depredators, as we call them, to help the fishermen know where these guys are, because they are really good at taking fish. But satellite tagging is pretty expensive. So at this point, we're more focused on the towed array approach that works well with our fleet, and fishermen are now also starting to look at switching over to pots where the boats are big enough to do that, because the whales are only getting better at it.
Well,
for education and outreach.
Linda, I think I better preserve a little bit of time for Embla, if we could end here or very quickly.
Yeah, maybe I could just wrap up by talking quickly about our crew apprentice program. So as other people mentioned, it's really difficult to help young people come into the fisheries or to get started in the fisheries. So we've started an apprentice program to help people get that first job. We've run over 50 people through it, over half of them women, to give them that start. And we're also providing entry-level loans to people to give them that initial start with buying quota that are low risk and low cost, while involving them the same in fishery management policy. So trying to address some of those same issues that we've seen in Iceland with challenges to entry level. So happy to end up there. I do see a lot of women involved here in fisheries management, and also sort of a growing number of women who are working their way into the fisheries, and we're doing all we can to try and support that. So I'll end there, but happy to answer questions. Sorry to run over.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Linda. Yeah, it's amazing to see how much good work is being done to connect women and families and small scale fisheries, and to develop the technologies yourselves, really through your organizations, to make it safer and more productive and more economic. So we're going to finish, I think, going sort of out into a bigger, more general picture of women and gender issues in the Arctic, because that's really what Embla Oddsdottir has done so much fantastic work on. Anyone interested in Arctic and gender issues knows Embla and her work. She's director of the Icelandic Arctic Cooperation Network, and her whole career has been focused on the intersections between research and policy and cooperation. How do organizations work together? She's currently chair of the Arctic Council's Social, Economic, and Cultural Expert Group, and she leads Icelandic Arctic Council Chairmanship Project on Gender Equality in the Arctic. So Embla, thank you so much, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you for including me in this important event. Thank you, Margaret, for your excellent lecture. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And Linda, for sharing your experiences and all the work that you've been doing with your community. But so Ross, I did something really fun last night, which was starting to read Margaret's book. So while I should have been preparing a really profound presentation on the larger picture of gender in the Arctic, 3.5 hours later, I was still reading the book. And I was reacting to the book both at an intellectual and emotional level. So I think maybe what I'm doing, it may be a little bit off book, but I would call them reflections. Because I felt that Margaret's work on Sea Women is of great importance for many, many reasons. I really enjoyed reading the book. It's not quite finished. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I really just had to put it down. It's of course always great fun to read about perceptions of Icelanders. We're something of a strange bunch of folks, but not always conscious of this until a mirror is held to our faces and we see a way of life and a worldview we take for granted most days. I just want to say this to Margaret. You had me at hello. If you understand that reference to Jerry Maguire, it's a fairly superficial reference, but it's what came to mind when I started reading. And I guess I fell a little bit in love with my country again when I was reading the book. I felt kind of inspired, so I want to thank you for that to begin with. I also want to say that I feel that this work is casting a stronger light on what we all know to be true already, that women have been hidden creatures, invisible from the pages of history and myths concerning abilities and interests, knowledge and strengths of women that have been sort of created and perpetuated, myths that are based on alternative truths which for some reason have taken a stronghold on our realities. I also think that Margaret is providing us with role models. And I think that the importance of role models should never be underestimated. It is enormously important for many reasons, but not least does it help us dispel myths and bring to light images of strong characters that can show young women of today that there may be alternative paths to choose. Paths they thought were unavailable to them. Now, I'm not saying that this means that these paths are easy or clear. They're likely filled with obstacles, although I find that most paths do have some hurdles. It may be existing structures that resist women taking certain paths, but knowing that other women have walked in these shoes may make the struggle to move forward a little bit more bearable. I also think that the more visible women become in history, the more coherent her story will be, and we can better understand our story. The greater the diversity of role models, the greater chance we have for encouraging a diversity in choice, gradually breaking down stereotypical notions of what belongs to women or what belongs to men. What women or men should be, and I include men because I believe men are also burdened with expectations, demands, judgments based on unhelpful stereotypical notions of what a man should be. I also think that this has implications not only in the context of fisheries, but also for other male-dominant spaces, industries or sectors. Various resource extraction industries being a prime example. The political, economic, and academic sectors. In all of these, we find women at a disadvantage. We've made some forward strides, of course, not least due to increased numbers of educated women. But they still struggle to deal with the male spaces or with reaching higher levels of positions. While we find more of them in project management, for instance, or at middle management levels, the top layers of society are still largely populated by men. And why does this even matter? Well, we could go into a philosophical discussion on equality, fairness, just societies, and basic respect. Or we could just discuss why greater diversity at higher levels of decision-making processes and bodies is crucial. The places where choices are made, the roadmaps for our communities are laid, and policies for hopefully sustainable futures are forged. I think we really understand, all of us, why this is significant, and are all cognizant of the value of many choices in creating a society that at the very least strives to move toward well-being of all, as opposed to one where protection of the privileges of few determine our landscapes. The project Gender Equality in the Arctic, which is an STWG and Icelandic chairmanship project, is now in its third phase and currently working on a report to be published at the end of the Icelandic chairmanship. We lead this project in collaboration with the Stefansson Arctic Institute and the Directorate for Equality here in Iceland. In addition, of course, to numerous international partners. Now, during our preparations leading up to the report, we reached out to a diverse group of people to gauge themes or priorities. This included our partners, our editorial committee, members of the STWG, the Social, Economic, and Cultural Expert Group, permanent participants, youth, and others. And through this process, we have found how empowerment is a recurring theme, not only for women and girls, but also men and boys, LGBTQ plus communities, indigenous communities. And it seems to me that this is our big task ahead, finding ways to empowerment. And although it can be somewhat elusive and difficult to fathom, capture, and maintain, whether it be at group, community, or individual levels, little pockets of empowerment can spring from unexpected sources. I'm not going to make this very long. I could ramble on for quite a while, but I do think that we're running a little bit out of time, and I think you wanted to have a couple of questions before we conclude. I just want to say, in the end, I want to share with you how listening to Margaret talk of my foremothers in Iceland makes me feel. While it saddens me that for so long, this story, her story, has for so long been forgotten, I also feel kind of a sense of relief and a sense of empowerment. Having had to listen in Gender Equal Iceland to relentless and somewhat demoralizing comments about what women can or cannot do, which is for half a century now, more. This is a godsend, as far as I'm concerned. Early in the chapter there, in chapter 3, there's a reference to Margaret's run-in with a skeptical character who doubts this information about the number and nature of sea women in Iceland, which just shows you that these perspectives persist within our culture, which is why these unsung heroes of our past have significant relevance for a modern woman, and providing armor for generations to follow. I really look forward to continuing to read Margaret's work in the future. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Sorry about that. We're essentially out of time, which it happens when you have a big subject, great speakers, and I think what we've done is laid the groundwork for another event, another chance to open up this dialogue more. I think it's been fascinating to hear about the role of women in the history of fishing in Iceland, and how that's changed so dramatically, and there are some barriers for expanding that. And then looking at Alaska and hearing Linda talk about the multidimensional organizations and groups and the role of women and bringing families into fishing and expanding community capacity and bringing science into fishing. That's just an amazing set of successes. And then thinking about and hearing opportunities to bring youth back into this and to develop new role models and do it in a way where we really respect diversity and equity and the well-being of everyone, and that fisheries and fishing and a healthy ocean become a foundation for a more just Arctic. That's kind of what I take away from all of this. So Niels, I'm going to turn it over to you for any last comments, and then we'll end shortly after that. And I want to thank the speakers so much for everything that's here. This has been recorded. It can be shared with others, and we will find a way to expand this dialogue fairly soon. Thank you so much. Niels, back to you.
Ross. Well, because it's 1st of December and it's the Icelanders are a nation of sagas and poetry, I'd like to read the poem that by Björg Einarsdóttir, a sea woman who was born and raised here in Eyjafjörður, Látra Björg. It goes like this. And it just to remind you of the importance of humor at sea. She was actually hurrying home on a small boat in very bad weather, escaping a storm. In Icelandic first, bið ég höttur blóðugar þó bregðu faldi sínum, ránar dætur reisugar rassi að væja mínum. I beg of the blood-harried waves, whose frothing veils harass, haughty sea goddess daughters, please will you spare my ass? Thank you. I think it's for Mike to finish this properly. Thank you.
Yes, I agree. I think we should get the last word to our good friend, Mike Sfrega. Mike, thank you so much for hosting us. And I learned about serial deprivators today. That was probably the new scientific jargon I take away from this. But thank you so much for allowing us to bring the Stevenson Memorial Lecture to the Arctic community through the Wilson Center, and congratulations again on the great work you do there.
Well, Ross, thank you. And Niels, I don't know how to top that. That's a tough act to follow, that poem. So I'm not going to try. Aside from saying to all of you, thank you to friends and colleagues for participating in this program, but giving it life. And Margaret, I'm with Embla. This work is simply, it's not just foundational. It gives us perspective, and it really gives us a path forward in terms of how we think about just our own roles in the world, in the Arctic. I have read your book. I have given it out as gifts. It will go out as gifts. It really is a wonderful piece of work on so many levels. And so thank you to friends and colleagues for bringing this to the Wilson Center, allowing us to give some voice and some notice to very important work that perhaps has been overlooked for way, way too long. And to those watching, thank you once again for participating in a Wilson Center program. Thanks to Dartmouth and Stefansson Institute and others, Linda, Embla, Margaret, Ross, Niels, and thank you so much, Michaela, for all of your work putting this together. So I thank you, and I agree, Ross, we're going to have to do something else as a follow-up to this.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for watching, and thank you all for participating.